Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm your host, George Mason, and I'm delighted to welcome to this episode of Good God, Brian Kaylor. Brian, we're glad to have you with us. I'll introduce you a little more in a moment, but it's a pleasure to have you and to be able to talk about your new book.
Oh, it's great to be here, George. Thanks.
So Brian Kaylor is the president and editor-in-chief of Word and Way, which is a Christian media outlet, and produces lots of articles on religion and culture on a weekly basis. And he has recently co-authored a book with a minister named Bo Underwood, and Bo is a Disciples of Christ minister. Brian is a Baptist minister. We like to call our disciples colleagues Baptists with a small b, don't we, Brian?
That's right. Yeah.
There's a lot of commonality between Baptists and Disciples of Christ, or at least our brand of Baptists. And when I say our, I mean those in the, I suppose, non-Southern Baptist world of Baptists. So you've written this book together. It's called Baptizing America: How the Mainline Church Built Christian Nationalism, something like that in the subtitle anyway. And it is due out officially June the 4th. But if any of you are watching this or listening before June 4th, the publisher will send you early copies if you pre-order. So get on that right away. But Brian, this is a provocative book because I think everyone is learning about and becoming either alarmed if they are on one side of this, or supportive of on the other side of this movement called Christian nationalism. It seems to be identified almost exclusively in our time with white evangelical Christians. And much of the case being made is that it is an attempt by a certain brand of conservative Christians to make America great again, to make it into a Christian nation. And of course, it claims that this has always been the case. In some ways, they're not wrong, because as you make this argument, the mainline liberal or progressive Protestant Christians from the founding on have increasingly, or not increasingly, but have consistently perhaps found ways of also expressing the desire for America to be defined as a Christian nation. So what spurred your interest in this? What was the origin of this claim that you and Bo wanted to make in the midst of this conversation?
Yeah, that's a good question, because this was a journey for us over several years. We've been writing about Christian nationalism, and that has been primarily focused on the way white evangelicals have been pushing and arguing for Christian nationalism in our contemporary politics. And one of the things that we started to notice as we were writing about the claims of those espousing Christian nationalism is that the quote evidence that they would point to say that we were supposed to be a Christian nation, classic things like under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, or the national motto, "In God We Trust," and a number of other examples that we unpack in the book. All of these things were actually put in place by mainline Protestant clergy and politicians. And after we started to notice this trend, okay, there's something interesting going on here. The white evangelicals are getting all of the criticism today, and they have deserved criticism today for what they're trying to do with Christian nationalism, but they didn't create a lot of the problems. And so we need to, if we really want to deal with the danger of Christian nationalism, both to democracy and to our Christian witness, we need to know how we got here. We need to know the origin story. And so that's the origin story of this book, was like, all right, what happened here? What's the part of the story that's not being told?
Right. Well, and I think that's really very true, is that, the criticism of the Christian right today and the labeling of them as being Christian nationalists, which incidentally there is a growing bristling happening from them about being so labeled as if, this is a new thing or it's a bad thing. Nonetheless, um, there's a lack of self-criticism from the left, you might say, about their role in creating the context that now the conservative Christian movement has entered into. But they didn't create it, is your argument. And so how do we get attention focused on ourselves so that we're not simply criticizing others without taking responsibility? I think this is a significant point in your book, and I'm wondering if you're finding people who are willing to listen to this and pay attention in
Yeah.
the mainline church.
So we are, which is encouraging thus far. I mean, it's early. I'm sure we'll get the pushback as well. I mean, as you know, the foreword to the book is written by Reverend Adrian Thorne, senior minister at the Riverside Church in New York City. Church aligned with American Baptist Churches USA and the United Church of Christ. And she comes from the Reformed Church of America and Presbyterian Church USA tradition. So we got four mainline Protestant denominations all wrapped up there in that representation. And so that was really important for us to get that kind of stamp from her, as well as some of the other endorsers of the book that have embraced the argument that we're making. And so that is exciting to see, because one of the things we really hope for as we write, with appreciation for the mainline tradition. So as you noted, Bo has been a mainline Protestant his entire life. I've had more of a journey. So I grew up in what would be considered a conservative evangelical Southern Baptist church,
Right.
but now would identify with the mainline side of Baptist life. I've, been on staff with churches associated with Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which Pew now identifies as codes as a mainline denomination, as well as American Baptist Churches USA. And so, we come from this saying, hey, let's look at our own community and what can we do to make a difference towards, separating the wheat and the chaff. Because if you grow up in a white Christian church in the United States, Christian nationalism is just in the air that you breathe.
Yes.
And so we have to do that difficult work to figure out what was American and what Jesus taught.
Yes.
And those are not always the same thing.
Well, part of what you're asking in this self-reflection for more mainline Christians is that they consider the ways that they have been complicit in promoting Christian nationalism. And I will say, as a person who is a Baptist and who has long claimed a commitment as a strict separationist in terms of separation of church and state, nonetheless, as a pastor, I have made concessions, and I have, put the flags in the sanctuary on Memorial Day weekend, Independence weekend, and Veterans weekend. Only those three, as a gesture toward a recognition that these were times when people were particularly sensitive to patriotism and the like. And we would, in these services at times sing hymns that were really filled with Christian nationalist language. And sometimes that bothered me a lot. And other times I did it as a matter of expediency to be candid about it, just because it's difficult to hold all of these folks together at times in churches. But one of my younger colleagues, who was a pastoral resident at our church, took that same philosophy, went to the First Baptist Church in DeLand, Florida, as his first full-time pastorate, and within about a year was no longer the pastor there because he took the flags out of the sanctuary, and this very patriotic church filled with lots of veterans and retirees could not get past it. This is, part of our Baptist tradition. And this was a church that was more or less affiliated with the Cooperative Baptist Church Fellowship. So I think I'm an example of people who have been complicit in this, in a sense. But I think maybe now we're becoming more and more aware that uh, it's not just them, it's us. I guess the question I have then after my confession, Brian, is
I'll bless you here.
thank you, Father, for I have sinned. Yes, but I think when I read the book overall, and I felt these pangs of conscience about it, and we realize how much American history and religious history is about, in a sense, struggling to find the right uh, valence about the relationship between religion and government. I think there's still going to be a question that I'd love to hear you talk about, and that is, if we really did this in a pure way, uh, would we end up with a naked public square, to use Newhouse's old term? Would there be a sense in which we are dividing ourselves in some way that becomes difficult for people to live as both Christians and Americans, or Jews and Americans, or Muslims and Americans, in a way that we have to sort of set aside our religious identities to enter into public life? I think that's partly the fear of this notion of a complete secular government. So could you address, how do we have the kind of secular government that our constitutional founders seemed insistent on, and we've struggled against in a way by this Christian nationalist approach with our motto and our, uh, uh, different ways that we've added under God and the like, in God we trust. Uh, how do we arbitrate this in a healthy way going forward if we were to successfully defeat Christian nationalism and return to this approach that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and thinking about implications here. And I'll know I appreciate your kind of self-reflection there, and we met that in the book, that we have both served as pastors at churches that had the flag in the sanctuary, and so we're coming from this as ones that have been on a journey as well. And part of my journey was being a member of a Mennonite church for several years in Virginia, and then coming back to a Baptist church, visiting my parents one year on the Sunday closest to the 4th of July, and being hit for like the first time actually seeing all of the patriotic hymns and the flag there in the sanctuary. And it hit me differently than when I had grown up with it as just normal, because it really actually isn't normal. It's in the long stretch of even just American Christian history. The flags are a pretty recent addition. We've traced a little bit of that history connected to particularly World War II and some other conflicts in the book. And so, yeah, the question then is, all right, so then what does it look like? And I think it is important to separate these two things. There's one thing about what we're doing when we gather together in the church that we need to make sure that we're very clear about who we are and why we're there, what kingdom we have gathered to serve. And, you can think about a church in some ways like an embassy. So when the United States sets up an embassy in another country, when you walk into that embassy, you are in the United States. And the flags that are flying are the United States. And the churches there, these are the embassies of the kingdom here. But it's also true that when we walk out the doors, we don't cease to be Christians. And we shouldn't be silenced as we walk into the public space. And I think, we can look at like the advocacy of a Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as a different model, because what Christian nationalism is doing is it's arguing that to be considered a real American, to be truly American, you have to be a Christian. And often, usually, it's a narrow slice of Christianity. So, right, if the Christian nationalism that we saw storming the Capitol on January 6th takes over in the United States, you and I won't count either as part of the power structure, right? Because we're not part of the narrow slice of conservative Christianity that would be established. And so that's important. But what King was doing was creating an interfaith movement. marching alongside with rabbis, with people of no faith. And it was a focus on a democracy, of actually us leaning into becoming a democracy. And because, our democracy is actually pretty young. It really doesn't happen until everyone can vote in 1965. And it's this idea of making all voices equal. And so, yes, he's speaking from his faith, but he's not demanding that people legislate and adopt his faith. He's saying everyone has a right in the public square to equality, to being an equal citizen. And so there's a difference there. You could both, like a Tony Perkins or a Mike Johnson or someone today, right? And a king might quote similar verses and might both quote the Bible. But what are they trying to accomplish? And how are they treating their fellow citizens in our increasingly pluralistic society? And so I think that is a really important difference. We can still talk about our faith, but we don't demand that all Americans follow it.
So I think you're pointing out a difference between the kind of Christian nationalism that the mainline has traditionally supported, which really goes more under the rubric of civil religion, I would say, and the kind of Christian nationalism that we're seeing among white evangelicals today. Yes, it's both a brand of Christian nationalism, but the mainline approach seems more committed to what Eisenhower said, essentially, which was that it ultimately comes down to a commitment to all men are created equal, which is a democratic principle. Now, we know that the Confederacy did not agree with that. And the Confederacy actually was a Christian nationalism. And it was very clear that their understanding of the nation was that all men are not created equal. I think part of the fear today, Brian, is that, democracy can be used by the new Christian nationalists or the Christian right without this commitment to all people being equal. And ultimately, then, democracy's procedures will end up with outcomes that undermine democracy, right? That we'll have what effectively is a caste system again, and a kind of autocracy, not democracy. So how do you respond to these differences while being critical of the mainline? Isn't there a significant difference between these kinds of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's right. And one of the ways I've kind of talked about is in some ways the Christian nationalism that we're critiquing is a softer, friendlier, cuddlier version, than what we saw on January 6th. But that doesn't mean that we should overlook it or that we should ignore it. And part of the issue I think what we have is we see is that what has happened is, I think there's two issues. One, we see that people have been discipled for generations to accept this kind of softer, friendly Christian nationalism, 4th of July, services and that sort of thing. But that can then become the gateway drug towards a more aggressive form. I mean, let's not forget that Donald Trump is a product of the mainline Protestant tradition. And so we can see where that got us. And so that's one thing that I think is important there. And I also think that the demographic shift has changed so dramatically since the late 40s, throughout the 1950s, the time period that we're looking at, the last big wave of kind of Christian nationalistic feelings that we had, that we're tracing in the book, was in that time period. And we're now in another wave. And these waves kind of come, every 50, 100 years or so in our country. And in that time period, mainline Protestants were the dominant tradition. So that's why they're the ones that are establishing everything. But we were largely a nation of Christians. So 92% of Americans in 1967 are saying that they're Christian. And that number had been in the 90s, right? Really throughout American history. Now it's only 68%. Right? So we have a third of Americans do not identify as Christian. And so today, the same things that mainline Protestants were doing in the 50s might have been unifying, might have seemed okay, but today would feel different, would pack a different punch. And so while I do think it's true that the mainline Protestant version wasn't as dangerous, part of that's because the nation has changed.
Right, right. So a lot of this sort of, I don't know, going back to reverting to the idea of a Christian nation, which we deliberately rejected when we left England and when we had our American Revolution, seems to be rooted in some crisis in which we feel a threat from the other. Uh, we we had that crisis in the Civil War, the threat that the liberation of our chattel slaves would mean the end of Southern civilization and white hegemony and those sorts of things. So therefore, the secessionist movement. We had the threat of communism in the middle of the 20th century that created this whole wave of adding the language of divinity to our public life and documents and Pledge of Allegiance and the money and these sorts of things. What's driving the threat today? Is it the changing demographics, would you say?
Yes, I think that is. I think that it's that fear of, I mean, I think, Robbie Jones has captured this well with the end of white Christian America, right? It's that fear that the nation is changing both in racial demographics and in religious demographics. And I think you're right. I think fear drives so much Christian nationalism. It empowers Christian nationalism. And then it's a cycle. Christian nationalism also inspires us to be fearful of the other. And so it is both creating, Christian nationalism is both creating fear and being empowered by fear.
Mm-hmm. One of the odd things about the rallies that we see that are basically like revival meetings, these political rallies that are Reawaken America and of course political rallies of Donald Trump and the like. There's so much Christian symbolism going on, and those of us who are studying this and analyzing it say, as you just did, and as Robbie Jones has made the case, that fear of change is underlying this. How do you account for the extraordinary joy that you see these people expressing when they come together? We would think they would be expressing their fears primarily, but what we witness is there is this euphoria of them being together, this joy. And to be candid, for those of us who are more in the mainline tradition, we don't have that same experience of joy in our view of things. And this is part of the critique, I think, from the right, is that more liberal and progressive Christians are constantly unhappy with the country and its progress and the like, and they are able to celebrate. I wonder if there's an analysis there that you have that that gives some balance to this idea of fear being a generative factor in Christian nationalism.
Yeah, you touched on something I think is really important. A lot of the analysis of these political rallies focuses on the politics of Christian nationalism. But the co-option of Christian liturgy and songs and symbols is really significant. As you know, I sometimes go to these events, occupational hazard, to go and see them in person and to report on them. So I've been to a Reawaken America tour with, Michael Flynn and Roger Stone and Eric Trump. And, these are the normal figures that are at these events. And, they sing the songs that we sing in church. And they pray, but they sing the triumphant songs. And so I think that starts to get a little bit, right? There is this sense of like, they're not the hymns of lament and they're not the, more reflective. These are the triumphant songs. We're coming together. We're going to win, and we're going to win because God is on our side. And so
Yes.
that, I think, does really power them. But then they also, I mean, they have baptisms. I mean, that was the toughest part of me at Reawaken America was, there and watching people getting baptized into this movement. And then I was at a Sean Foyt event at a state capitol, and he's doing communion and passing out communion to everyone, right? It's becoming this alternative church, if you will, that is so wrapped up with MAGA politics
Yes.
as a chief kind of confession or creed of this this church. And so that's really alarming. But when you're there, when you're in this movement and you have like-minded people, right, you're right, there's excitement that can come from that. And they have this, I mean, the rally around the flag thing that can happen during war, right? Even when we're first scared, but then we all get, pumped up and get ourselves excited and ready to go fight as a nation. We saw this after 9/11. These kind of moments happen. I think the same thing is happening inside the MAGA movement. In that on the one hand, they are worried about the direction of the country. They're scared of the other, but when they come together, they can get themselves, rallied up. They can sing the happy, Christian songs, declaring that God is great and victorious, and God's on our side, and that can get them excited to go and wage battle.
Well, I guess one of my hopes is that as we take seriously your critique of the mainline tradition, and we look at ourselves and our complicity in it, that we would also not just take responsibility for what we have done, but we would also figure out positively, how do we address our current times in a way that ignites a vision of our faith and our country that is compelling enough for us to have enthusiasm for it. The fact that we have such a low voting turnout to begin with, is an indication to me that there's a lack of passion around democracy generally. But when you conclude the book, you give us some prescriptions. So you're kind of saying, okay, here's the case, but I think it's important for you to outline some of those things. What can we do? What's positively can we do to begin to reconstruct our understanding of the relationship between church and state?
Yeah, I think that's great. We do try to end on this note. All right, so we can do something about it, and that's actually one of the key reasons about this book is we think that mainline Protestants, more moderate, progressive Christians, are the ones that should be willing to do something. And it's cathartic to just point at the white evangelicals and say, look at them. Right. But what if we actually did something in our own circles of influence, in our own communities, to actually reduce Christian nationalism? So I think that's really important. And of course, we start with exactly what you and I have both done a little bit of here is, look at your own church. Look, when have you been complicit? When have your church advanced Christian nationalism, even of a nice, cuddly, patriotic kind of version of it? But how can we change our own church, our own denomination, our own context? We do have some advice about the flag and how to have that conversation in ways that hopefully don't get pastors fired. But it's an important conversation that we need to address in our congregations if we're going to make a difference. And I think that's really what our call is. It's like, let's do this self-reflection. Let's look at the ways we can change. And then outside of the church, one of the things that we really argue for is that democracy is itself something that we should be willing to defend. And that we don't need to, prop up, God as the justification for this. We're not going to argue that democracy is God's will, or, particularly that a particular candidate is. We just think democracy is itself a better system than any other option. I mean, you and I both come from the Baptist tradition, and, our early Baptists experienced persecution from, Christian colonies. I guess it wasn't a Christian nation yet, but Christian colonies were literally persecuting them, right? We know what happens. We can see what happens when some people are treated as second-class citizens because of their faith.
That's right.
That's not good. And so democracy is itself good. It's worth defending. It's worth pushing for. David Gushee has, his book about defending democracy from its Christian enemies. And, Christianity right now is often lining up against democracy in the United States and around the world. And
Right.
we would love to see Christians standing up and saying democracy is good. The
Right.
democracy treats all people as equal. And,
Mm.
you can believe that if you're a secularist. You can also especially believe that if you're a Christian, that all people are created equal in the image of God. And so let's treat all citizens equally. And I think that's something we could rally behind.
Mhm.
And it's under attack right now. Democracy is threatened.
It really is. And it is an extension, as you say, of our Christian faith, because our driving duty as Christians is to love our neighbor as ourselves. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. To love your neighbor means to defend your neighbor's right, at the very least, to exist and to practice his or her faith or lack thereof without consequence in public life. And if we can do that, we're exercising a politics of love, in a sense, whereas Christian nationalism is exercising a politics of power to protect one's own place and one's own right to dominate. I think that's a significant difference between the two outlooks, and promoting democracy is, I think, a more natural outgrowth of our sense of Christian imperative. So, wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Great. Well, Brian, congratulations on the book, You and Bo. Hope it does really well. It has certainly spurred some very interesting thoughts on my part, and I'm sure in our circles it's going to be talked about quite a bit. But it's an important contribution right now to this conversation of Christian nationalism. And we thank you for all the work you do, not just this book. And thank you for being on Good God with us.
Thank you so much for having me, George. This was a lot of fun.
Great.